It was a beautiful afternoon when he parked his brand new Rolls-Royce in front of his own home, no different than any other day. But before he could even step out of the car, sirens blared. The sound of approaching police cruisers echoed through the quiet street. Why? Because someone had made a call accusing him of stealing his own car. In that moment, he wasn't just a man with a luxury vehicle. He was a black man, alone in a world quick to assume the worst. What followed wasn't just a simple misunderstanding, but a painful reminder of the prejudice many still face. But here's the twist: those who called the cops would soon regret their decision. Why? Stay tuned as we unravel the shocking truth. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. You won't want to miss how this story unfolds. James had always worked hard for everything he had. As a successful entrepreneur, he'd built his business from the ground up, one step at a time. The Rolls-Royce parked in front of his house wasn't just a car, it was a symbol of his hard work, a reward for the sacrifices he'd made along the way. Living in a quiet, suburban neighborhood, James had always felt at peace. This was where he'd built his life, where he'd raised his family, where he'd found a sense of belonging. He was a familiar face to his neighbors, someone who had earned their respect. For the past few years, his life had settled into a peaceful rhythm: work, home, family, community. Every morning, he left the comfort of his home to put in the effort that would ultimately pay off. And in his eyes, every small success was a victory, a step closer to the life he had always dreamed of. But that afternoon, as James parked his sleek, polished Rolls-Royce in front of his house, everything was about to change. He stepped out of the car, the soft gleam of sunlight on its smooth surface giving him a brief moment of pride. He had worked tirelessly for years to be able to afford such a luxury. James felt a sense of accomplishment, an acknowledgement of how far he'd come. The quiet suburban neighborhood, with its neat lawns and friendly faces, was his domain. It was supposed to be a place of peace and security. But that afternoon, his world would come crashing down. He wasn't just a man with a new car. To some, he was now a symbol of something much darker, something he could never have imagined. James had barely closed the door of his car when he heard the unmistakable sound of screeching tires. At first, he thought it might be an emergency vehicle, or perhaps someone speeding. But when the sirens followed, his heart sank. His eyes turned to the street, and that's when he saw them: two police cars, their flashing lights bright enough to pierce the tranquility of the afternoon. They skidded to a halt in front of his driveway, their sirens deafening in the otherwise silent street. James was momentarily confused. What had happened? What had caused this sudden police presence? He looked around, searching for some kind of clue. Then, before he could process what was happening, the officers stepped out of the cars, one by one. Officer 1, tall and confident, stepped toward him, his hand near his holster, eyes narrowing as they locked onto James. The other officer, Officer 2, stayed back slightly, but the moment they arrived, their combined presence was overwhelming. James's stomach turned. It was a feeling of dread he couldn't shake. He tried to stay calm, but there was something in the air that immediately felt wrong. This wasn't just an ordinary interaction. He wasn't just a man on his property. Something about his appearance, something about the color of his skin, had triggered this. His chest tightened, and in that moment, all of his previous triumphs, his success, and his quiet pride in his achievements seemed irrelevant. There was only one thing that mattered now: how he was being perceived. How had his mere presence in this neighborhood led to this? The officer in charge, Officer 1, barked a command: "Sir, step away from the vehicle." The words were sharp, like a slap in the face, jarring in their suddenness. James froze. His hands were still slightly outstretched, the motion from getting out of the car incomplete. He didn't understand what was happening. His mind raced, trying to make sense of the situation. Did I do something wrong? His voice cracked as he tried to speak. I don't understand," he stammered. His hands instinctively began to rise slightly, trying to show that he was no threat. "This is my car. I live here," he explained, but his words seemed to vanish into the thick, oppressive air between them. The officer didn't answer. He simply motioned for Officer 2 to move closer. The two officers began to circle around him, their eyes scanning his every move as if he were an animal caught in a trap. The scrutiny was immediate and intense, invasive even. James could feel their eyes boring into him, like they were trying to assess whether he was telling the truth or not. But this wasn't a conversation. This wasn't a fair exchange. This was judgment. It was something James had known about for years, but never truly felt in his gut until now. "Is this your car?" Officer 1 asked again, his voice sharp, accusing. It wasn't a question, it was an accusation. The way he said it made James feel like he was already guilty, as if the officer had already made up his mind about what was going on. "This is insane." James felt a cold rush of fear, his throat tightening. "Yes," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. The confusion was mounting, but so was the dread. "I just bought it today from the dealership." I've been saving for this moment for years. He tried to explain, but it felt like his words were being swallowed by the atmosphere. He was speaking, but the officers weren't listening. They were already deciding who he was and what he represented. The officer stared at him, expressionless, and then asked, "How did you afford this car?" The words hung in the air like a heavy weight. James's blood ran cold. The question felt like a judgment in itself, an implication that he couldn't possibly afford a luxury car, that it didn't fit into the picture they had in mind for him. The officer's tone made it clear that this was no longer just a question about his car. It was about who he was, his very right to own something like this. The implication stung deeply. Why wouldn't I be able to afford it? The thought flashed through his mind like a sudden burst of anger, but he bit back the words. He had to stay calm. He had no choice but to try and explain himself without escalating things. "I've worked hard for it," James said, the frustration evident in his voice now. He was growing more impatient by the second, but he kept his composure. "I own my business. I've been building it for years. I paid for this car the right way. It's mine." But still, there was no sign of understanding in the officer's eyes. Instead, Officer 1 turned to Officer 2 and muttered something that James couldn't catch. It wasn't a conversation. It was an assessment. James could see it in their eyes. They had already made up their minds about him. There was no benefit of the doubt, no willingness to consider his explanation. Meanwhile, Officer 2 was already rummaging through James's car, opening the door, rifling through the glove compartment, flipping through papers in the passenger seat. What could they possibly be looking for? James stood there, his hands clenched by his sides, trembling slightly. His body was taut with anxiety. The sense of violation was overwhelming. His car, something he had worked so hard to earn, was now being treated like a potential crime scene. "This isn't happening." He could hear the whispers from the neighbors now, their voices faint but growing louder as they gathered around their windows. He could feel their eyes on him, each glance like a silent judgment. Mrs. Thompson, the woman who lived across the street, was standing on her porch, wringing her hands, her face pale with anxiety. She wasn't helping. She wasn't saying anything. She was just watching, just like the rest of them. But she was the one who called the police. The reality began to sink in for James. The assumptions that had been made about him, based solely on his skin color and his car, had already set this whole chain of events into motion. It wasn't about the car. It wasn't about the paperwork or the fact that he was legally parked in his own driveway. It was about who he was, and in that moment, James understood a painful truth. To many people, especially to those who had never walked in his shoes, a black man with a luxury car didn't fit the narrative they had created in their minds, and that was enough to make him a target. "What's your name?" Officer 1 asked again, his voice growing more impatient. James's heart raced. It was the third time now that the officer had asked him a question, but there was no real interest in the answers. The officer wasn't looking for the truth. He wasn't looking for a reason to let James go. He was just looking for more reasons to make him a criminal. "This is insane." "James Collins," James answered quickly. "I live right here. I've lived here for years." There was no response from Officer 1. He just stared at James, sizing him up, as if deciding how best to proceed. The seconds dragged on, and James could feel the weight of the officer's gaze, the subtle judgment in his eyes. In that moment, James realized something truly chilling. He wasn't being judged on his actions or his words. He was being judged simply for being who he was, a black man in a nice neighborhood with a luxury car, which in the officer's eyes didn't belong. It wasn't about the car, it was about me. James stood motionless as the officers continued their search. Every passing moment felt like it dragged on for hours. His body was tense, his hands trembling slightly as he kept them at his sides, trying to steady himself. He wanted to speak, to say something, anything, to make the officers understand, but the truth seemed so distant now. What else could he say? He had already explained. He had already told them the car was his, but they weren't listening. They were searching his life, his success, his identity as if they had the right to. His mind raced, questioning everything he had worked for, everything he had believed in. The very foundation of his life was being pulled apart, piece by piece, all because of the assumptions these officers had made about him. His eyes flicked to the door of the Rolls-Royce, where his hand rested against the cold metal, as if somehow holding on to the last shred of control in the situation. He felt small, like a child caught in a lie, even though he had done nothing wrong. The officers' movements were mechanical, methodical, almost as if they had done this 1,000 times before, stripping people of their dignity piece by piece. It was a humiliating, suffocating experience. How did it come to this? His pride, his years of work seemed to mean nothing here. The suspicion he felt from the officers, the assumption of guilt based solely on his appearance, was something he couldn't escape. The officer in charge, Officer 1, barely acknowledged his presence as he continued to search the car. He didn't respond to James's attempts to explain, not even a glance in his direction. Officer 2, who had been methodically rifling through the car, turned to James only to make sure his eyes stayed on him, watching for any sign of aggression, any movement that could justify their actions. James could feel it like an invisible rope pulling tighter around him. He could feel the officer's eyes, heavy with judgment. He could see the lack of empathy in their movements, their eyes scanning not for truth but for a reason to escalate. It was the quiet brutality of institutional racism, the suffocating weight of being perceived as a threat simply because of who you were. Then amidst the tension, he noticed Mrs. Thompson, his neighbor, standing in the doorway of her home, watching the scene unfold. Her body language spoke volumes, her hands wringing nervously, her face pale, her expression filled with regret. She had called the cops. She had made that decision based on a fleeting suspicion, one that had been born from a racial stereotype. And now, standing there, James could see that she knew it was wrong, but it didn't matter anymore. The damage was done. She could apologize all she wanted, but it couldn't undo what had already transpired. The officers didn't need her to confirm their assumptions. They had already made their decision about him. Mrs. Thompson's eyes met his, and for a fleeting moment, she seemed to recognize the injustice of the situation. But she said nothing. Her lips trembled slightly, her gaze shifting between the officers and James, unsure of how to act. She had already cast her judgment in the form of a 911 call. Now, all that was left was guilt, an awareness of her complicity in what had been a clear violation of James's rights. She had allowed herself to believe the worst about him, and now she was watching it unfold, powerless to stop it. Her silence stung more than anything. It wasn't just about a mistaken phone call. It was about the deep-seated prejudices that made her think it was okay to question his right to be in his own neighborhood, to own a car like that. This was bigger than her. This was the same kind of racism that had shaped so many moments in history, moments that were ignored or swept under the rug. It wasn't just her mistake, it was part of a larger pattern. And in that moment, James realized the personal cost of her actions, as well as the systemic nature of racial prejudice. This wasn't a one-off incident. It was a reflection of a society that judged black people based on their skin color and nothing more. The second officer continued to search the car, not missing a single detail as he rifled through the glove compartment, moving around the interior as though he was looking for evidence of something that simply didn't exist. What were they expecting to find? James thought. A stolen item, drugs, a weapon. It didn't matter that James had already explained. The assumption was there. A black man in a luxury car in a predominantly white neighborhood couldn't possibly have the right to own it. The longer the officers searched, the more it became clear that they weren't searching for evidence of a crime. They were searching for a reason to make him guilty, to prove their suspicions right. James stood there, arms crossed, his posture tense. He could feel the eyes of the neighbors on him, their gazes heavy, judgmental. He wanted to scream, to shout that this wasn't fair, that he was innocent. But instead, he stood there silently, trapped in the system that had already labeled him guilty. The longer the officers searched, the more he felt like he was losing control of his own narrative, his own life. Everything that had been built was now under scrutiny: his home, his success, his right to stand there and exist without being questioned. The injustice of it was suffocating. James's eyes burned with frustration as he watched the officers continue their search. His gaze was sharp, but it was laced with fear and helplessness. He was trapped, not just in this moment, but in the world that had set the stage for this to happen. His eyes, wide and filled with emotion, told the story of years of fighting against systems that sought to hold him back. He hadn't done anything wrong, but the longer this continued, the more the feeling of being targeted overwhelmed him. His heart raced in his chest, the pressure building inside him. The frustration of being treated like a criminal when he was, in fact, the victim, made his head spin. The lighting around him seemed to get harsher, casting deep shadows on his face. The coldness of the situation mirrored the coldness of the officer's indifference. He could feel his pulse quickening, the sweat on his brow, his body on edge. He could feel his breath coming in short bursts, his thoughts clouded by the injustice of it all. How could they do this? How could they treat me like this? His mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. He had worked so hard for everything he had, and now it was all being questioned based on the color of his skin. He could feel the years of discrimination, of unfairness, of being judged before being seen, bearing down on him. This wasn't just about this car. It was about every moment where his success had been questioned, where his worth had been doubted. The air felt thick with tension as the officers continued their work, moving slowly as if they were searching for something that didn't exist. James's mind was spinning, but he held on to his composure, though every second felt like a weight on his chest. It wasn't just the police who had judged him. It was the people around him, his neighbors, the people he had lived alongside for years. None of them had stepped forward to defend him. Not even Mrs. Thompson, the neighbor who had made the call, had said anything. She had watched, silently complicit, as the officers held him in suspicion. But now, after what felt like an eternity, she moved forward. Slowly, she stepped onto her porch, her body tense, her hands wringing together nervously. She looked at the officers and then at James, guilt written all over her face. She knew what she had done. She knew it was wrong. And now, there was no going back. As Mrs. Thompson stepped forward, James could feel the anger rising in him. How could she do this? The betrayal felt like a physical blow. Mrs. Thompson had been his neighbor for years. She had waved at him on many occasions, smiled, and exchanged pleasantries. She had been the one to stand by in the community, pretending to be friendly, but now she was the one who had called the police on him. The weight of that decision hit him harder than any of the words she had uttered in apology. In that moment, he felt the deep emotional wound of racial injustice seeping into his soul, as if it was something ingrained in the very fabric of his life. The more he thought about it, the more it made sense. This wasn't just one woman's mistake, it was part of a larger pattern of systemic racism. Had he ever truly been seen for who he was? Or had he always been judged by what others assumed of him? His face was a mixture of fury and disbelief as he looked at her. Mrs. Thompson seemed to shrink under his gaze, her eyes filled with guilt and regret, but it was too late. The damage was done. Her apology wasn't enough. Words weren't enough. It was too late to fix what she had set in motion by calling the police. She had cast the first stone by assuming he was a criminal based on nothing more than the color of his skin and the car he drove. And now here he was standing before her, caught in a system that had already decided he was guilty. James could feel the anger building in him. This wasn't fair. It was never fair. His eyes, filled with a raw intensity, locked onto hers. He wasn't sure whether to scream or to cry, but instead he stood there, his words cutting through the thick tension. "Mrs. Thompson," he began, his voice cold, the anger barely contained. "This isn't just about a phone call. You put my life in danger. You judged me without knowing me. You assumed because of the color of my skin that I didn't belong here, that I didn't deserve what I've worked so hard for." His voice cracked slightly with the weight of the truth, but he continued, his words now like knives. "You assumed the worst about me, and now look where we are. You watched as they treated me like a criminal in my own home." She was silent. She looked down at her feet, unable to meet his gaze. The guilt was suffocating, but it wasn't enough. Not now, not when the damage had already been done. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Her words were full of regret, but James knew they were hollow. Apologies meant nothing when actions had already spoken louder than words. She could apologize all she wanted, but it wouldn't undo what had happened. She could never take back the fear that had gripped his heart, the feeling of being wrongly accused, the humiliation of having to stand there and explain himself when there was no reason to doubt him in the first place. The officers had made up their minds, and nothing she said could change the course of the situation now. He looked at her, and for a moment he could see the deep sorrow in her face. She had realized her mistake, but it didn't matter anymore. She had already participated in something that, for him, was a daily reality, a harsh reminder of the prejudice ingrained in society. James didn't respond right away. The raw emotion in his chest was threatening to burst, but he held it back. He could feel the heat of anger bubbling up again, but he knew the truth. It wasn't just Mrs. Thompson who had done this. It wasn't just her fault. It was the system. It was the ingrained belief that a black man didn't belong in spaces like this, that he had to prove himself, even when there was no reason to doubt him. The frustration, the helplessness, it wasn't just about her mistake. It was about the years of being constantly questioned, the years of facing suspicion simply because of who he was. "I've done nothing wrong," James finally said, his voice steady but filled with conviction. "And you know it. But it doesn't matter, does it?" He looked at her, and then he turned his gaze to the officers who were still standing by, ignoring him, waiting for something to escalate. The silence in the air was deafening. James's frustration grew as he saw that Officer 1 wasn't even looking at him anymore. His attention was elsewhere, still focused on the backup that was arriving, as if this entire situation wasn't even worth acknowledging. The officers had made their decision long before Mrs. Thompson had apologized. He was already guilty in their eyes. There was no justice in their actions, just cold, dispassionate procedure. His entire existence, his rights, his freedom had been diminished by their assumptions. The reality of it all hit him harder than anything else. No matter how he explained himself, no matter what he said, they had already chosen to believe something about him that wasn't true. James's eyes narrowed as he looked at Officer 1, and in that moment, he realized something that made his blood run cold. It didn't matter that he was innocent. It didn't matter that he had done everything by the book. To these officers, his success, his achievements, the hard work he had put into building his life, none of it mattered. What mattered was the color of his skin, and in that moment he understood, deep in his bones, what so many others had experienced. The quiet, insidious way that racism operated, day in and day out, without anyone ever really acknowledging it. The frustration continued to boil inside James, but instead of letting it consume him, he turned to his phone. He had something to say, something that needed to be said, something that couldn't be ignored. His fingers trembled as he began typing, the raw emotions of what he had just experienced spilling out into the screen. He wasn't just typing for himself. He was typing for everyone who had ever been unjustly targeted, for everyone who had ever been made to feel like they didn't belong, for everyone who had been reduced to a stereotype, a statistic, a face in the crowd that was judged before being understood. His words came fast, too fast to fully comprehend, but they were honest. They were real. This was his story, and it was time to share it. He didn't hesitate. He didn't second-guess himself. The post was raw, emotional, and filled with the kind of truth that many people were afraid to say out loud. He spoke about what had happened, the pain, the anger, the humiliation, but he didn't stop there. He wrote about the larger issue, about systemic racism, about how black men were treated differently, simply because of the color of their skin. He wrote about how the assumptions others made about him could have cost him his life, could have cost him everything. As he hit post, his heart raced. He wasn't sure what would come of it, but he knew one thing: he couldn't stay silent anymore. Within hours, his post had gone viral. Messages of support flooded in from all corners of the world. Strangers, friends, family, people who had never met him but had experienced similar struggles shared their stories. They all spoke of their pain, their frustrations, and their hopes for change. For the first time, James felt like he wasn't alone. He wasn't the only one carrying the weight of this injustice. He wasn't the only one who had faced this kind of discrimination. The power of his words resonated, and it spread like wildfire. The flood of support was overwhelming, and yet it was comforting. People were listening. People were starting to understand. James wasn't alone in this fight, and that realization gave him the strength he needed to keep going. This wasn't just his battle anymore. This was everyone's. In the quiet of his living room that evening, as he sat reflecting on everything that had happened, James realized that his fight wasn't over. His post had started something, but it was only the beginning. The world needed to hear these stories. The world needed to understand what it meant to live under the constant pressure of being judged before being seen, of being treated like a criminal because of how you looked. But it wasn't just about him. It was about all the people who had been silenced, all the people who had been left behind, all the people who had been told their voices didn't matter. James knew that if anything was going to change, it had to start with people like him, people who were brave enough to stand up and speak out. And it had to continue with everyone else who was willing to join the fight for justice. The movement was already growing. The streets were filled with people of all races, all ages, standing together to demand change. The signs they held were powerful, filled with messages of justice and equality, but also of unity. James stood at the front of the crowd, his face resolute and determined. He wasn't just participating in the protest, he was leading it. His presence there symbolized the struggles that had been fought for generations, but also the hope that change was possible. The energy in the air was electric, charged with the determination to make a difference. People were waking up, speaking out, and demanding the change that had been long overdue. It was a moment of collective power, a reminder that together, they could make the world see the truth. As the protest continued, James took a moment for himself. He stood on his porch, gazing out over the neighborhood. The early morning light bathed the streets in a soft glow, casting a peaceful serenity over everything. But James knew that this peace was fleeting. The fight for justice wasn't over, it had only just begun. He stood there, feeling a quiet sense of resolution, knowing that he would continue this fight for as long as it took. There was no turning back. The change he had started was only the beginning, and he would be part of it, no matter how long it took. As he reflected on everything he had just experienced, one thought remained with him: how many more lives would have to be shattered before people finally understood. He wasn't the only one who had faced racial injustice, and he wouldn't be the last. But the question was clear: how many more people had to suffer before real change came? His eyes were filled with both sorrow and hope as he looked into the camera, speaking directly to the world. How many more lives would have to be shattered before people finally listened?